Welcome to the Home Birth After Cesarean podcast. Due to the rate of unnecessary C-sections, the lack of support, and limited options for VBAC moms in the hospital, more and more women are choosing to have their VBAC babies at home. This podcast was created for women to share and listen to stories of home birth after cesarean. I'm your host, Rachel Garrett. Today we have Sophie with us, and Sophie is actually from England. So I'm excited just to be able to have a different perspective because so far we've only had people from the US on the show. So Sophie, do you want to just give us a little bit of an introduction to who you are?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I live in the south of England, and I had my first child 4 years ago in 2016, which was a cesarean. And then this year I've had a home birth. So that's how I've kind of come to be talking to you.
So I know one of the things we were chatting about a little bit before we started recording was just what was your perception of the birth culture where you live, both before you had your cesarean and then after?
So I guess before my cesarean, a lot of what I'd heard and read and seen was all media based. And so a lot of it was kind of that very stereotypical, you give birth on a bed, on your back, in a lot of pain, and to expect lots and lots of pain. And that was kind of very similar to my experience first time around, until obviously I had the cesarean. But then since the cesarean, I kind of educated myself a lot better. And I think there's been a definite shift in general education in this country surrounding, natural birth and the things that you can do yourself to make the process a lot easier. For one, hypnobirthing has become a lot more popular, and I think that that's something that a lot of people they're kind of being recommended it on the NHS here on our National Health Service, which is really helpful. But yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So we can kind of get into this when we get into your home birth story, but did you feel like you had a lot of support, not only in wanting to have a VBAC, but then wanting to have a home birth VBAC?
So I had a lot of support from my health provider about having a VBAC. That was very much what they wanted for me. It was the direction that they were kind of gearing me towards. However, it was, you can have a VBAC if you have one under these circumstances. And so they said to me that the most ideal scenario would be for me to be in a so I don't know what the alternatives are for hospital deliveries for you guys, but for us over here, we have birth centres, which is like midwife led, and then the main kind of labour delivery suite, which is consultant led. So they would prefer a VBAC to be on a consultant led, doctor led ward, no water birth, continuous monitoring, induction if you go kind of over term. Those are kind of that's the box that you have to fit into to have a VBAC. And yeah, I didn't want to fit into that.
Yeah, that's very similar to a lot of, I guess in the US there are some places that are more VBAC friendly. Like I know we have some birth centers that would allow, I'm doing air quotes, allow a mother to have a VBAC at a birth center, but I think across the board, unfortunately, it's very similar to that. Like there's these certain circumstances. I know some places would even require you to have an epidural in case there was an emergency C-section that happened after with the trial of labor, things like that. So I think that there are definitely some similarities with that, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
It's too bad there aren't more.
I think definitely that was another thing that they had said to me, was that they would prefer that, as soon as I arrived in labor, they would put a cannula in, just in case. And it's having that mindset. You're not going to get into the zone that you need to be in to have a calm birth if you're thinking, oh well, I've got this cannula in my hand ready to go, because any minute now they're just going to come over and tell me, no, it's time for a cesarean. And
exactly, it's almost, you're not trusting the process then. Like you're not
setting yourself up to have a similar experience to the first time.
Exactly. Well, if you want to take us back to that first pregnancy and birth, wherever you want to start with that.
Yeah, sure. So my first pregnancy, 2016, I did a little bit of preparation for birth. I did what we have over here is NCT classes, which is just kind of like just general education about birth and the things that you can do to prepare yourself for birth and pain relief and breastfeeding, all kind of summed up into one. To be honest, the only real thing I got out of that class was some good friends. The education was, it was very much just things that I already knew
Was that
from just
a hospital-based program?
no. So that was actually something private that you can pay to do extra. I think that the hospital did do their own version of kind of antenatal classes, but because we'd already opted to do the NCT ones, we didn't do those as well. So I'm not kind of sure what those cover, but yeah. So the NCT ones, I mean, it was good, it was interesting, but it was just largely going over things that we already knew, which was kind of good in a way because we felt really prepared. We felt like we already knew what all of our options were in terms of pain relief and, you know, promoting that upright, forward, and open birth position to try not to be on a bed and those kinds of things. So yeah, so when I went into labour, I kind of I was very keen, as first time mums often are, to get things moving as quickly as possible. So I opted to have a stretch and sweep. I don't know if do you have those? I guess that kind of
Like a
thing. I don't know what
membrane
it's called
sweep?
over there. But
Hmm.
yes, yeah, exactly that. So I had that on my due date. And then about 3 or 4 hours later, I started having contractions, and that was kind of the start of my very, very slow, early latent labor. So those contractions, they came slow at first, but I think throughout that first night, they then kind of quickly got to that sort of 3 in 10 and quite intense in my back. And that lasted for 2 days before we kind of thought this is getting silly now, nothing's progressing. And so we went to the hospital. They said I was at kind of 2 to 3 centimeters, nothing really further happening. So they sent us home. And then it just kind of carried on like that. And we just ended up going back because I was so exhausted because I'd not really slept or had much rest or anything like that. So went back into the hospital. Again, no progress. And so each time I'd been in, I'd been going into the birth centre because I was first time mum. I had no kind of risk factors or anything like that. However, when it got to this point where it had been a few days and I hadn't progressed, they decided that they wanted to move me over to the labour ward, which was frustrating at the time, I think, because I was really keen to stay in the birth centre. It was very relaxed there. It was a much nicer environment. But hey ho, so we moved over to there, at which point my waters went whilst I was there, and I had another assessment to see how far dilated I was, and I was about 5 centimeters. And the midwife seemed really confident. She was like, "That's great. I think we can send you back to the birth centre." So our birth centre is attached, so it's literally just a corridor away. So went back over to the birth centre where things slowed down again, and I was reassessed a couple of hours later, and apparently back at 2 centimeters, which I didn't know that was something that could happen, but apparently you can kind of go backwards. Obviously, I suppose different midwives' hands are measuring things slightly differently anyway. And at this point, they started to get a bit concerned because my heart rate wouldn't come down. It was kind of difficult to tell from their monitoring belts whether they were looking at my heart rate or the baby's, because mine was kind of matching the baby's. So they were concerned that there might be possible signs of an infection. So they asked if I wanted to kind of carry on and see how things went. So we carried on for another, I don't know, probably another 8 hours after that. And then I was still at 2 to 3 centimeters. And so at that point, they decided to take me for a cesarean.
Was there like a conversation around moving
Yeah.
towards
So
cesarean?
Yeah, so I think it had been brought up a couple of times before that point, but I was obviously really keen not to go down that road if I had an option. But because I wasn't dilating, there wasn't really much other choice, much other. I mean, they said I could have perhaps gone on the hormone drip, but by this point it was kind of 4 days in, and I had absolutely nothing left, and the prospect of going on the hormone drip then, and people often say to you, if you are induced by the hormone drip, you get contractions kind of come really hot and heavy. And the prospect of that, when I was already exhausted, I said, no, I don't want to do that and then end up having a cesarean anyway. I'd rather let's just get the baby out.
How did the whole cesarean itself go in that immediate postpartum time?
So the cesarean was thankfully went really smoothly, no complications, really quick. The anaesthetist was fantastic, keeping me calm. I didn't really feel like I could have that. So they brought the baby over to kind of sit on my right up here on my chest as soon as he was born, but I didn't really feel confident holding him because I was so shaky, I guess, and tired, and all of the drugs and everything like that. So my husband held him for a while. And then as soon as they'd stitched me up, they wheeled us into a separate room, and I had skin to skin for ages, which was lovely. And yeah, so that part was great. But then when they did my son's initial bloods, it showed signs of an infection. So we both had picked up some kind of infection throughout probably all the multiple examinations that I'd had. That's what they kind of ascertained it must have been from. So we both had to go on intravenous antibiotics, which was fine for me, but not nice watching my son go through that. Obviously, there's millions of worse things that could have happened, but it still wasn't pleasant. And it meant we had to stay in the hospital for I think 5 or 6 days. Yeah, 5 days I think it was, before we could go home. Which again, there are far worse things to have happened, but it was just a shame that we kind of missed out on that bit of paternity leave with my husband. And yeah, just being in hospital is not nice, is it?
Right. And you don't get good sleep in a hospital. You have people
No.
coming in and out all the time and those little interruptions. So, yeah, that's
Definitely. One thing I would say though is that was good about being in the hospital was I had the benefit of seeing probably 10 or 15 different midwives over the course of that 5 days. And thanks to that, I was able to establish breastfeeding really well, by drawing on various different people's experiences and opinions, and getting people to help me in different ways because I was really keen to breastfeed. So I was lucky that happened in a way.
so then was VBAC on your mind at all? Was that something like did you know you wanted more children?
So after the birth, I would say, obviously, I had a great outcome. My son was fine, everything was fine. But after the birth, I would say I struggled a lot emotionally with what happened. And I did not want any more children because of that. It took me a good 18 months to kind of come to terms with it and think, oh, actually, maybe I would like to have another one. I kind of always assumed that if I did have another one, or I'd definitely just have an elective cesarean. I don't want to go through that experience again. I really struggled, etc., etc. But when I did fall pregnant, I just felt completely differently. I didn't see it coming. If you'd have said to me 7 months ago, you're going to have a home birth, I would never have, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have laughed. But yeah, so it very quickly became apparent to me that I definitely wanted a VBAC. And then I had to kind of find out what my options were as far as what the hospital would, as you say, allow in quote marks, and what I wanted.
With processing through your first birth, was there anything that you did that really helped you through that time?
So I tried something to help, which was a service that they offer here through the NHS, which is a birth afterthoughts. So if you've had trouble kind of coming to terms with your birth, or a difficult experience, they offer you the opportunity to sit down with a consultant midwife and go through your birth notes, and to try and just piece together what happened, because obviously in the heat of the moment, you don't, I mean, I struggled a lot to remember anything that happened. I had to get my husband to tell me because I think I blocked it out, to be honest. Um, so I hoped that that would help me, but honestly, I just found it harder after speaking through it all. It then dredged everything up and it made me feel quite emotional. And it made me feel like I'd failed, I suppose, in a way. And I know a lot of mums who have had that experience feel that way that I've spoken to. Um, so that kind of put me on the back foot a little bit. But then I looked into hypnobirthing, as I said before, and I think that's what really helped me visualize and be able to see, actually, no, this is 100% what my body was built to do. Just because it didn't work out the first time, it doesn't have any bearing on how it's going to work out this time. So yeah, hypnobirthing is the one thing that really helped me, and that's definitely what steered me in the direction of a home birth.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is how did you decide on having a home birth versus doing a VBAC at the hospital?
hmm So I knew that my option for having a VBAC at the hospital was in the same area where I'd had my cesarean, the same kind of few rooms where I'd been stuck in that horrible days of labour and struggling, and I knew that kind of being in that area was just, it was never going to be conducive to a good environment for me. And also being constantly monitored, not being able to use a pool if I wanted to, all of those things, it just didn't seem appealing. So that's when I decided to start doing the hypnobirthing. And we did like an online hypnobirthing pack. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the Positive Birth Company. And it was just a few of the statistics that they were talking about in there about kind of home births and how having a baby at home was statistically one of the safest places to be. And I don't know, just a few things that were said made me look into it a bit more. And made me think about, okay, well, what things from home can I bring into the hospital to make it a better environment for me? And then from there, I gradually went and decided, actually, I don't want to bring my home into the hospital. I just want to be at home. And suggested it to my husband, who looked at me like I was completely insane. But I got him to watch that part of the hypnobirthing pack with me that evening. And I think it was about 20 minutes long, this section. And he just looked at me afterwards and he was like, okay, I get it. Let's do it. Let's go for it.
That's great to have. I know that, I mean, support is huge in any type of preparation for birth, but especially a VBAC and especially a home birth. So that's awesome that he was supportive of that after kind of realizing the same things that you did.
Definitely. I was surprised by it because I knew his initial reaction would be, you are crazy. But I didn't expect him to get on board so quickly, but he did, and I'm glad that he did.
Was that towards the beginning of your pregnancy or where within your pregnancy?
I think I was about 28 weeks around then when we decided to go for it. So yeah, kind of middle onwards.
Had you been doing prenatal care with the hospital up until that point then?
Yeah, so just midwife appointments, which had been, I think, due to COVID, it was just kind of few and far between on the phone, or and then the occasional appointment where they do your measurements and kind of listen into baby, and that was it really. So they had put me on to be consultant led, which had meant two consultant appointments throughout my pregnancy at the hospital. So the first one had been before I'd considered a home birth. So they'd just gone through that kind of hospital environment, continuous monitoring, no water birth. They'd just explained that those were my options, and they'd given me kind of a list of statistics about what my chances of achieving a VBAC would be, which, to be honest, I didn't really find them particularly inspiring. They were, I don't know, I mean, they were definitely keen for me to have a VBAC rather than have an elective cesarean, which is obviously good because that was what I wanted. But yeah, they weren't inspiring.
Yeah,
But
it's
then
like
my second,
I was going to say it's like we want you to have this VBAC, but we're going to put all of these obstacles in the way so that you can't do this, this, and this, and then we're going to tell you that your statistic of having a VBAC is like less than 60% or 50% or something
Exactly.
like that. It doesn't
Yeah.
really add up to be a good supportive environment in the end.
No, definitely not. And then I had a second consultant appointment, which was after I decided to have a home birth, and that was horrendous. I was expecting it to be difficult because I knew that obviously by choosing to have a home birth, I was essentially going against their advice, what they'd wanted for me. Um, Before choosing the home birth, sorry, to go back slightly. So before deciding for definite on the home birth, I'd had quite a few conversations to see if there was any way that I would be allowed to have a VBAC in the birth centre, because it is a lot more relaxing, it's a lot more homely, and just a nicer environment, a lot calmer. And because it is attached, only a corridor away, I kind of didn't really understand why I wouldn't be allowed to do that. It didn't make any sense to me. But yeah, so it was a definite no on that front. It was okay. And they even said to me, you know, your only other option would be a home birth, which we would, and their words were, we would have to support you, but it wouldn't be something we would choose for you. So yeah, so the consultant appointment, when I explained about having a home birth, wasn't ideal. I knew that they weren't going to be supportive, but the consultant that I saw just basically gave me an out of context scaremongering story about a lady who had experienced her scar opening during labour, and how they'd had kind of minutes to get the baby out, and that was in a hospital setting. So you can imagine how different it would have been if she'd have been at home, etc., etc. And it just, you know, there was no context with it, and it was really unnecessary. But as I said, I was expecting for them to not be supportive. Luckily, I had a very supportive midwife, and she was brilliant at keeping my feet on the ground and keeping me ready for it.
So, when did you start seeing that midwife then?
So that was just my NHS midwife that I'd been seeing throughout my whole pregnancy. So over here, when you switch to a home birth, I think it had recently changed, but basically you see the same community midwives, and then the midwife that could come out to your home birth will just be whichever community midwife is on call that day, which is cool. So it could have even been my midwife, who I'd been seeing through my appointments, which would have been lovely. It wasn't, but it didn't really matter. They were wonderful midwives that did come. Yeah, so the only thing that changed was that my last appointment, I say my last appointment, it wasn't my last appointment, it was my appointment where I went over my birth plan, was at home, so that she could do a little assessment just to be sure that everything was kind of how it needed to be for the home birth.
So, just to clarify then, so that the midwife that you were seeing was through the birth center.
Yeah, so what happens over here is, once you realize you're pregnant, you refer yourself to the midwife, the community midwife team, and then you're assigned a midwife who you meet either at the doctor's surgery, the hospital, or children's centre, whichever's closest to your house. And then you just keep meeting that same midwife back and forth until you go into labour. So it was just that same midwife that I'd been seeing kind of from the start.
That's cool. So then they
Yeah.
do home birth and the birth center births then.
Yeah. So it's a bit confusing in the area that I'm in. So basically, I've got a birth centre that is not attached to a consultant unit, close to my house. So all of the midwives that work in my community are attached to that birth centre. But if I was to go to hospital to have the baby, I would be going to a different town, because I'd have to go to a consultant led one rather than the standalone birth center, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding all of that
Yeah.
correctly. Okay, well, take us to, I guess, leading up to your labor and birth with your second child then.
Okay, yeah. So one thing that I've been kind of really concerned about for this time around was that really long latent phase that I'd had with my first, because it was just so exhausting, so yeah, so hard to get through. So it was something that I'd been like looking into in terms of, oh yeah, so with my first, I had a really horrendous back-to-back labor, which is why I think I struggled so badly with pain. Whereas this time around, I had kind of done quite a bit of research into things that you can do to like open your pelvis and be able to move baby around during labor if need be, spinning babies, that kind of thing. So I'd done a lot of those exercises in preparation for my labor. Every day I'd been doing various forward leaning inversions and bits and bobs like that just to kind of safeguard myself. But anyway, kind of worrying about that long latent phase of labor, I'd had a lot of midwives say to me, don't worry about it. You know, you've done that the first time around. Chances are your body will not do that again. Obviously, it will definitely still happen to some mums, I'm sure, but I was very lucky this time around that I didn't get that. So I started having contractions about 3:30 in the morning, and by 4:30 they were 3 and 10, pretty intense. So
And
I think about
how far along were you at that point?
so I was 2 days past my due date, so 40 weeks plus two. Yeah, so about 5:30 in the morning, I think it was. So after about 2 hours, my husband rang the home birth midwife team just to kind of say, you know, this is what's going on, fully expecting them to say, okay, call us back in an hour, see how she's doing. But surprisingly, they sent a midwife out, and she came over and was just chatting to me kind of in between contractions. And then a second midwife arrived not long after. I had kind of said to myself that I didn't want to have any vaginal examinations because the first time around, I found it really demoralizing to continually be told, you're 2 centimeters, you're 2 centimeters, you're no further along. And I just thought, you know what, if I'm on a high, if I've got good morale, I really don't want that bringing me down. But I was struggling with the intensity of the contractions. It was completely different to the contractions with my first labor, completely different. In a good way, it was more manageable, but it was far more intense than I'd experienced before. So I did consent to an examination in the end. So I had an examination done whilst my husband took our eldest son to my mum's house. She lives a couple of roads away, so it was nice and quick for him to just pop him over there. So I had an examination done where they said I was 3 centimeters, which I was dreading. But to be honest, if everything was so intense that I didn't actually have time to even let that get me down. I was far too busy having contractions and being upright and concentrating on all the things that I'd been training myself to do. And yeah, so it was great because I kind of labored all around my house, kind of walking around, holding on to various things and just being where I wanted to be in my own space, which was lush. And when my husband got back, he kind of set about trying to get the birth pool filled up, which was cool. At first, we had a bit of an issue with the attachment for the sink. It kept blowing off every time we turned the water on. So that was a bit of a disaster because I thought, oh, I'm never going to get in there. But luckily, they got it sorted. And yeah, so once I got into the pool, it felt a lot more manageable. I kind of calmed down a little bit. But once I did get in, I started having kind of involuntary urges to push, even though it was kind of too early for that. So with every contraction, I was really, really struggling. I had to kind of just go with it and push because that's what my body was trying to do. And I really couldn't stop it. So I had another check at that point, and I was, I think, something like 7 centimeters. And my waters, they said, well, my waters were kind of really, really bulging. So I think that's where the urge to push was coming from. So got back in the pool, and a few contractions after that. I was still doing this pushing because I just couldn't stop myself, and I pushed really hard, and my waters like burst into the pool, which was the biggest feeling of relief ever. And I think up until that point, for some reason, I'd had it in my head that one way or another that this was going to still end in a section in hospital. And when my waters went, I just thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to do this. This is going to happen at home, how I want it to. So that kind of gave me quite a boost to get through the next bit. And then, yeah, just carried on labouring in the pool, and eventually started to properly push. And the midwife was having trouble kind of seeing what was going on because she didn't have one of those. We didn't have like a small mirror. We didn't have anything smaller than like a giant mirror, so it wasn't possible for her to see. And yeah, so she wanted me to get out so that she could have a little look to see what was going on. But as soon as she said that, I could feel the baby move further down. So I just started pushing a bit harder, and we eventually started to get to the point where he was crowning. And despite all of this upright, forward, and open that I've been trying to do, I just couldn't seem to push him out that way. I couldn't feel him moving down further. So I got my husband to grab, we've got like a little stepping stool for my son that he uses to brush his teeth. So I got my husband to grab that and we put it in the pool and I sat on that leaning back, and yeah, managed to push his head out that way. So his head was born under the water, but the midwife noticed that he had his hand up by his face, kind of covering his ear and his forehead. So that kind of explained why it had been a bit of a struggle to get him out in the position that I was in. So at that point, she asked me to stand up, so that she could help me kind of guide him out, because we needed to get him out a bit faster. So I stood up with one leg on the edge of the birth pool, and birthed him kind of standing up, and then picked him up and pulled him up to my chest, which was just amazing. Such a good feeling. And yeah, that was that.
That's wonderful. So different. And I love that you touched on that up until your waters broke, kind of in the back of your head, you were thinking like, oh, this is going to end the same. Do you
Definitely.
think that that like had an impact on your birth at all, or that like that changed anything for you?
I don't know, but I genuinely think that thought was completely, it was subconscious. I had no idea that I felt that way until I said to myself, "Oh my God, I'm going to do this at home." Until I said that to myself, I just thought I didn't know that I'd kind of been holding that back underneath it all. Um, and I think, yeah, maybe it held me back a little bit in the labor because, everything was so intense and I'd been feeling that urge to push for so long. I think maybe something was holding me back. But yeah, as soon as we got to that point, it felt very real, and it felt great. It really did.
So how long was that labor from that
Oh
first
yeah, sorry, I didn't
contraction
explain
that you
that very
started?
well, did I?
No, that's okay.
So first contraction was about 3:30 in the morning, and he was born at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. Well, that morning, so about 6.5, 7 hours.
So a lot quicker than your first one.
A lot quicker. About 3 days quicker.
Great. So then tell us about that immediate postpartum time. So you help catch your son and he bring him right to your chest and
Yeah.
you
So
did you
I
stay
had to
in the
brought
pool?
him right up, and then my husband kind of just completely supported my weight so that I could kind of waddle back down onto my little stool that I'd been sat on, and then back into the pool, which was lush because it was all warm and nice. Um, and yeah, so that was an amazing feeling. And luckily, one of the midwives had been kind of snapping away pictures because it was very calm. There was no, stress or any panic like my first birth. It was just everything was completely calm. And yeah, so we've got lots of lovely photos of those kind of first few moments, which is really special. My husband wasn't fussed by cutting the cord, so we had some delayed cord time, so before we cut it. But obviously, because I was in the water, they didn't want to leave me in too long because I'd had a postpartum hemorrhage the first time around, so there was kind of concern that that may happen again, but it didn't. So we had, I think, probably about 10 minutes, I think, in the pool before I cut the cord. Yeah, so my husband wasn't fast on cutting the cord, so I cut it whilst I was holding the baby, which was lovely. That was a really nice feeling. And then my husband had some skin to skin time whilst I hobbled out of the pool. And then from there, I went and led on my sofa, which was very surreal. It was all very unusual, just being at home for this period of time. It was amazing. So I went and led on my sofa, and had gave the baby a little feed whilst they were checking to see if I needed stitches. So unfortunately, I did have a second degree tear that needed stitching, and the midwife wasn't confident that she could stitch it at home. So they have kind of like levels of what they're happy to do at home versus when they think actually you need to be in a theatre. So she wasn't confident she could do it at home. So she said that they would need to transfer me in via ambulance to the hospital to be stitched up. At that point, to be honest, I was so elated that I'd been able to birth at home that I really couldn't have cared less as long as I wasn't separated from the baby. I didn't mind at all. Obviously, because of COVID, my husband wouldn't have been able to come with us. So I wasn't keen on that, but at least they said that I wouldn't have to be separated from the baby. But luckily, when they rang to transfer me through, the midwife that they spoke to was one that I had spoken to throughout my pregnancy, who had also had a home feedback. And she was really keen for me to not have to come in. And so instead of transferring me, she sent out a more senior midwife to come and stitch me up at home, which was amazing. So she came with her big kind of head torch and extra large flashlight, and they stitched me up on the floor of the kitchen, which was again very surreal with lots of gas and air. And yeah, and that was it really. Once that was done and all the baby checks were done, the midwives left, and yeah, I was just upstairs in bed with the baby. It was incredible.
Do you remember about the birth of your placenta?
Oh yes, oh yeah. So just before I got out of the pool, I did have the injection to bring that on. I can't remember what they call it now.
Like a
Yeah,
Pitocin
so
shot?
something. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I literally just kind of stood up and it just kind of plopped out, to be honest. It was a great feeling, really smooth and warm and just like a lovely feeling. And apparently I had an enormous placenta, which makes sense. My baby was quite big.
How big
So
was he?
yeah, he was 9 pounds too.
Okay. How big
So
was your
I
first
didn't know
son?
what that is in kilos. So 9'4" my first was, so very similar.
So then tell us a little bit about just like the first couple of weeks or first couple months postpartum with your second son, especially compared to your first son.
Okay, so it's completely different. I mean, so first time around, I felt like a patient. I felt like I did have major surgery, and I felt like I'd had major surgery. And everything was a struggle. You know, that first week in the hospital, even just reaching to get my son out of his crib, I ended up not putting him in there because I had to keep asking nurses and midwives to help me get him out. And I just thought this is ridiculous. So I would just sit with him on my chest all the time. Versus this second time around, I was, I mean, out for a walk with my elder son the same day. And, you know, it was like nothing had changed. It was like one day I was pregnant and then the next day a baby was there, and there was no, obviously I was sore from the stitches, but I mean, the amount of kind of numbing that they had been able to give me for that, I didn't really feel the pain of it for a few days anyway. And I think I was on such a high from the birth. Absolutely nothing was bringing me down at that point. It was, yeah, I mean, polar opposite experiences. This time around, I never even stepped foot in the hospital. Last time around, it was 5 days plus the labor. So over a week. Just so different. Breastfeeding, ironically, was difficult the first time around in that I struggled to get my son to latch. And so I ended up using nipple shields. And I used them with my first son for the entirety of our breastfeeding journey. So I used them for nearly 2 years. Whereas this time around, I was really keen not to use them. However, using them the first time around had kind of shielded my nipples from that excruciating pain that you can often get with feeding the first few weeks. So the first few weeks this time around, I really struggled with the pain. It was difficult, but we got through it, and now it's easy as anything. So I'm glad.
That's just so cool to hear just how different it can be. And
Mhm.
when you were talking about like that feeling of being elated and it's almost like you're on a high, I mean, the cocktail of hormones that your body's producing after a physiological birth like you had with your second, that whole mixture of hormones gets completely interrupted and changed when you have to go through something like a cesarean birth and the surgery and all of those extra people and interventions and things like that. So that totally makes sense why you felt completely different after the birth of your second.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, first time around, it's you definitely have that feeling at the back of your head of kind of failure, and why didn't it work out how I wanted it to go. And as I said, I'd done those NCT classes the first time around, and we'd made some really nice friends. There was a group of about 6 of us pregnant women, and all of the other women had had beautiful natural births, and I was the only one who'd had the cesarean. And I just felt so, I couldn't relate to any conversation that they were having, and I just felt alone, completely alone in that. And now that I've had this home birth experience, I just completely understand everything that they were talking about, and I feel so proud of myself for, not that it was my fault the first time around, but I feel proud of myself for doing it this time. And that it happened the way it did was brilliant.
For moms who are maybe considering having a home birth after having had a cesarean, is there anything that you would want to tell them or any advice that you would have for them?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the key things that helped me plan my home birth was being really confident in knowing the risks, knowing the statistics. There's so much information available out there. But one of the things that I remember that really helped me was something that my midwife kept saying, was that risk. So the biggest risk that they always talk about with a VBAC is obviously uterine rupture. And it's, especially if you've only had one cesarean, it's a really small risk. It's really unlikely to happen. Obviously, that the outcome, if it does happen, is horrific, but it's a very small chance. And not only is it a small chance, there are a lot of early warning signs. And my midwife was really clear with me that any midwife attending a home VBAC will be on high alert for these kind of warning signs. And there will be a low threshold for sending you straight into hospital if they think that this is likely to happen. And I think that that's what you've got to do, is just have an open mind and think to yourself, if there are any of these warning signs, I'm just going to go straight to hospital and I'll have my birth there and it will still be fine. But, don't let it put you off, because it's such a low chance of that happening, and they know what to do. They know what to look out for. So don't let it put you off, because it nearly put me off when I first looked into it. And then, yeah, learning all the facts and figures and the early warning signs like scar pain and things like that, it just filled me with a bit more confidence and helped me stick with my choice.
Information is power, right? Once you have
Definitely.
all of that information and you can decide what you want to do with it. And if that feels good for you, then that's great. Awesome.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact that having had a cesarean, it doesn't make your body any less able to have a natural birth. It has no bearing. So, you've got every much a chance of having a natural birth as a first time mum would. So why not go for it?
Exactly. That's a great perspective to put it in. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Home Birth After Cesarean podcast. Make sure to subscribe, leave a rating, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. If you're interested in sharing your home birth after cesarean story, send us an email at hbacpodcast@gmail.com. See you next week.